Andy, you're on mute.
Thanks, Leigh. Appreciate you. So, without further ado, once again, thank you to everyone for being here. It is my pleasure to inaugurate the first online version of the Cane River Reading Series. It means so much to me that you're all here. Without further ado, let me briefly introduce our reader of the night, and then I'm going to let her have the floor. Zoom etiquette, I'm sure you guys have done this enough at this point to know, but let's all make sure to keep ourselves on mute, and, at least for now. Just so you know, we're going to let Leigh read, and then afterwards, we're going to have a brief question and answer period. So, fabulous. That's what I have. Without further ado, let me introduce Leigh Camacho Rourks. So, I first met Leigh Camacho Rourks during my first year at Northwestern State University, actually. She was, if I'm not mistaken, part of our second installment of the Cane River Reading Series ever. I actually think one person was at that reading and is still here tonight, and thank you so much for your continued support all along the way. It means everything to me. In any case, at that point, Leigh was a doctoral candidate at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. She has since completed that degree and has gone on to do fabulous and amazing things. Most particularly, Leigh is the author of Moon Tree and Other Orphans, an amazing collection of short fiction that won and was published, that won the Black Lawrence Prize and was published by Black Lawrence Press, I believe, in 2019. I'm going to think that and pretend that it's okay for now. Any other case, Leigh's stories speak to me about like the beautiful and ugly truth of what it really means to be from the South, what it really means to be from multiple cultures at one time, and most of all, what it really means to be human. So without further ado, I'm going to throw the microphone to Leigh, and once again, thank you all for being here. Let's all give her a nice warm wave at the microphone as we let her take it away.
First of all, thank you so much, everyone, for coming out in the evening via Zoom. I know you're all exhausted, and it's so very kind of you to come and see me today. Thank you, Andy, for inviting me and for that lovely introduction. Normally, when I do readings, I ask whoever invited me if they have anything particular they'd like to hear, and Andy actually asked that if I didn't mind, I'd read some nonfiction. So we talked a little bit about it, and I'm actually going to read, I kind of want to warn you ahead of time, I'm going to read my hurricane essay. So I know you guys have just been through a hard hurricane, and this is an issue, a situation very close to my heart that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So I'm going to read that essay, and then at the end, I'm going to read a piece of flash fiction, which will leave us, I think, with some hope from Moon Trees and Other Orphans. So that's what I'm going to do. And the only thing I'm going to say before I read this is that this was written a few years ago, quite a few years ago, and it was published in December magazine. The numbers themselves are a little out of date. They've gotten bigger, not smaller, but the facts are generally otherwise correct. At the time, I lived in Lafayette. So this is called How Fragile the Land. The lot I live on is about 1/3 of an acre. It's the biggest in my neighborhood and is one of the main reasons I bought my home, land. When I was a child, I was taught it was important, an investment, a clear measure of a person's success. The earth is damp here in Louisiana. Our yard floods so often that the Bermuda mix we planted, a ferocious grass that takes over each garden we attempt, has given up on certain patches. Tall, thin-bladed swamp grasses grow in those low, wet spots. We joke about planting a cypress, and we build the yard up with dirt we excavate whenever we dig a hole for another doomed lemon tree. My family moved here to Louisiana after we lost our house in Miami to Hurricane Andrew. It took a while, but I fell in love with this state that I was born in, made it my home, and it is disappearing. You can fit nearly 32,000 copies of My American Dream over the amount of land being carved away from the Louisiana coastline every year. I did the math. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the state is hemorrhaging wetlands, shrinking at a rate of 16.57 square miles a year. These wetlands, along with the disappearing barrier reef islands beyond them, are our main protection from hurricanes. But on average, a chunk larger than the city I live in disappears from Louisiana every 3 years. Over 10,500 acres are just gone, poof, every 12 months. The USGS website says that this works out to about a football field of swampland an hour, or nearly 4 wild, wet versions of my lot. In the 1850s, rich Southerners boarded steamboats that ferried them from a rail station in Patterson, Louisiana, out to a little island off the coast, which was considered to have what the article Har Louisiana Last Island calls the finest beach in the world. Isle Dernière, or Last Island, was a barrier island, a buffer between the ocean and the seaboard. Technically, it still exists, though now it is a chain instead of a single landmass. Large swaths of the original island swallowed by the Gulf, and for the most part, it's only visited by scientists. I've never boated out to the little stepping stone chain that has replaced the last island, but I have spent a lot of time thinking about its final moments. In the summer of 1856, while tourists leaned into the warmth of the sun and danced through nights cooled only by ocean breezes, a hurricane, the first major hurricane to be recorded officially on the American Gulf Coast, swirled through the Atlantic and into the Gulf. It was unnamed, unwatched. The technology we use today, satellites and supercomputers and dropsondes, had not yet been invented. Nearly every article and book about the island, about the hurricane that split it in two, about the vacationers who lived through the storm and those that died there, mentions a carousel. An Island in a Storm, Abby Salinger writes, at first the carousel was solid and still. Wind-blown sand had accumulated into a dune that had grown high enough to hold the frame firmly in place. That night, however, the waves beat against the dune, eroded it, and swept the sand away. The carousel began to spin. I wonder if, over the howling winds, you could hear the squeak of it turning. I've lived through many hurricanes and have never gotten used to just how loud they can be. The way the air roars against your house, and even the small storms. A noise you can feel in your chest as the pressure changes. A noise that crashes in waves and then suddenly disappears with the eye of the storm. A vacancy that always leaves me feeling deaf and unsettled. The soft call of the spinning carousel must have swelled in that sudden calm, an eerie replacement for the birds that had gone silent in the wake of the storm. There were no evacuations. About half of the 400 people there died. Survivors brought home stories of latching onto the carousel, holding to terra firma by the handles of the child's ride. It's a surreal picture, the sort of thing that belongs in a disaster movie. But a hurricane can drag a building from its foundation, yank a 1,000-year-old tree out by its clinging roots. A man is a silly thing in a force like that, a straw doll in the shanking jaws of a rabid beast. In 1992, the call for the mandatory evacuation of Miami-Dade County seemed ridiculous. I had just turned 17, and even I knew Hurricane Andrew was not really coming. For days, everyone said that there would be no direct hit. They said the storm was weakening. The storm was not an easy forecast, meteorologist Matt Daniel writes. On August 21st, 1992, the National Hurricane Center had Andrew pushing much further north and away from South Florida. Andrew was only a tropical storm that Friday, and no one had any idea that Andrew would rapidly intensify into a Category 5 storm 2 days later. It was hard for people to understand the speed with which information on the hurricane kept changing. And so it seemed like every adult who talked about the storm scoffed at the official panic. I volunteered at an animal rehabilitation center that summer, cleaning possum, raccoon, fox, and owl cages, warming frozen mice for the raptors, and blending mealworm shakes to feed baby birds. The man who ran the center patted my hand while we discussed the storm. He reassured me that even if Andrew did hit, modern building practices would prevail. We would be fine. As far as I know, the Animal Rehabilitation Center did not survive. We didn't pack like people evacuating. We packed for a vacation, a night or two in a hotel. We were not the sort of family that traveled much, and when we did, it was for the holidays, visiting grandparents and aunts and uncles in Baton Rouge and staying at their houses. Bring your swimsuit, my mother said, and something nice. You never know, we may get to stay a couple of nights. We were gone for several weeks. We drove north, perpendicular to Andrew's path. The traffic was horrible, and no matter where we went, the signs were the same: no vacancy. We drove and drove and drove. Around us, all of South Florida spilled north in a human storm surge we could not escape until Tallahassee, where we finally found an empty room in a small motel. We shuffled to the room, half asleep, the little ones propped in my parents' arms. The day after Andrew hit, the newscasts were clear. If you lived in Dade County and you left, stay gone. It is not safe here. You do not have a home. The room was little, 2 double beds, a bathroom, the television. My mother made a pallet on the floor for me, a nest of covers and pillows pilfered from the beds. The little ones shared one bed. My mother and stepfather had the other. Apollo, our chow, stalked the small spaces between us. We sat on those beds, watching the pictures of a place both familiar and alien cycle over and over on the television. Pictures of abject destruction. Everything was ruined. This was before the 24-hour news cycle, or maybe it was the start of it. It was certainly the start for me. We could not look away. A few months ago, a picture circulated on Facebook. In it, a battered Louisiana highway sign is surrounded by overgrown grass. It is unremarkable, except on this sign, the simple white silhouette of Louisiana has lost its familiar shape. It is half the original size, cracked and crinkled along its edges, as if the state has been nibbled, picked at, and discarded, a half-eaten sandwich left to mold. It is terrifying in its smallness, the familiar becoming broken, alien. The image was created by Matter for Louisiana Loses Its Boot by Brett Anderson, which discusses the devastating effects of Louisiana's shrinking coastline. It's a map without wetlands, created as a more honest representation of the boot, which the author believes will help Louisianans understand what is happening to our state. It would not erase the intractable disagreements around global sea level rises, energy jobs versus coastal restoration jobs, oil and gas companies versus the fishing industry that paralyze state politics, but it would give shape to the awesome stakes, both economic and existential, that hang in the balance. Louisiana is one of the places in America where the term melting pot seems less cliched. We joke that since there's so many cultures, since so many cultures bump up against one another there, the state is more a gumbo than anything else, a rich, thick soup of scraps. From the self-described rednecks to the Creoles, to the Cajuns, to the Yats of Chalmette, the granddaughters of the Confederacy, the sons and daughters of slaves, the Irish Channel, the French settlement, the German coast, and beyond, Louisiana's cultures bump and mingle. At the store, I may hear mostly English in a variety of accents, but French and Spanish, Italian and Vietnamese all catch my ear. There is a lot of hate, a lot of racial strife and ugly, backward-thinking fights, and a lot of love, mixed marriages, and hard-won friendships. The thing we all have in common, though, is a fierce strength, a prideful hardiness. We fancy ourselves a rough and tumble sort, hosting hurricane parties and eating mud bugs and riding four-wheelers and walking down dark streets in the French Quarter with barely a thought. It's hard to imagine we live in a fragile state with lacy edge, shifting borders. The signs have been surprisingly easy to miss. Bob Marshall explains, for years most residents didn't notice because they live inside the levees and seldom travel into the wetlands. But even those who work or play in the marshes were misled for decades by the gradual changes in the landscape. The problem with the football field metaphor is also what makes it so nice, so easy to understand. When the statistic that Louisiana loses a football field of wetlands every hour is repeated, we picture a long rectangle of land. We picture our children making passes across it, our idols running long. We imagine something solid and continuous. But the truth has been harder to hold steady in our minds. A point of land eroding here, a bayou widening there, a spoil levee sinking a foot over 10 years. In an ecosystem covering thousands of square miles, those losses seemed insignificant. There always seemed to be so much left. When you live in a state that has absorbed so many people, so many cultures, so many conflicts, it's easy to imagine it's big enough, strong enough to absorb anything, even loss. A friend of a friend said recently that this issue was not such a big deal. Louisiana will adapt, he said. Someone I didn't know nodded. In 2014, a survey from the Americans Wetland Foundation found that nearly 3/4 of Louisiana residents considered saving the coast to be the most important issue of our lifetime. And yet, it is one we have a lot of trouble wrapping our heads around, so we don't seem to be able to do anything about it. The truth is, there is a plan, and this plan has still not been executed. Bob Marshall explains that a $50 million plan for marsh creation is on the table. It will use slurry pipelines. They dredge sediment out of the river, pump it into some of the sinking basins, and just recreate those areas as they once were. Unfortunately, it is a $50 billion plan without $50 billion. There just isn't the political or private will to drop that kind of money unless, as Marshall points out, the worst case scenario has already happened and the crisis is upon us. And without the wetlands to protect us, without barrier islands doing their job, the next crisis is a big one, and it's just a hurricane away. My father called me a few days before Katrina hit. "Are you watching the storm?" he said. I had no idea what he was talking about. It was the first week of school and I was a new teacher. I taught one class as a graduate student, graduated, and then suddenly, somehow, I was teaching 3 composition classes at a university in Hammond and 3 more in Baton Rouge over an hour away. 6 classes. I was excited and terrified, and I didn't have much time for television. My father sounded worried though, so I turned it on. I knew I must have turned it off many times between that moment and the weeks after Katrina hit. I went to work, packed, evacuated, cried, slept, turned my back, refused to watch. Still, somehow, I remember it always being on. I was back in the 24-hour news cycle I'd made a point of shunning. Things happened quickly. Television maps became the focal point of life. The cone of uncertainty shrank until it was replaced by evacuation lines that shifted and changed color too fast to process. We were an hour away from the mandatory evacuations in New Orleans, and the borders of the recommended evacuations were shifting closer, jumping rivers and roads to cover more and more land. My boyfriend left the decision to me. I was the one who'd already lost everything once, he said. I was the one shaking so hard I could hardly stand. We left. And so did everyone else. Once again, I was in a storm surge of cars. The traffic was horrible, and the air in our neon was broken. The car was black, and the wind would not blow, and the cars would not move, and the August sun beat us down. The heat was unbearable. Our cat panted and drooled, and when we could, we stopped for ice and put it in her cage. I rubbed it against her mouth, begging her to take it for water. We put her in the back seat, out of the glare of the windshield, her carrier buckled in next to the fat computer monitor. As we drove, I replenished the ice, scooping it from the styrofoam cup we'd filled, unbuckling my seatbelt and swinging my body over the seat back to reach her cage, to tell her she would be okay. It would have been an easier drive if I had not been filled with panic, if the last home I'd left to escape a Category 5 storm had been there when I'd gone back. Hammond did not take a direct hit, and even though New Orleans did, for what now seems like a split second, It looked like they would be okay. And then the levees broke. And while everyone else watched the never-ending coverage on the television, I cowered, too afraid to look, too afraid to turn away. When Andrew hit Louisiana, we were staying at my aunt's house in Baton Rouge. He'd followed us from Miami, and after the television told us we couldn't go home, my parents packed us into the car and continued west. So did Andrew. Our paths converged. He settled down during his trek to Baton Rouge, petering out and then gearing back up once again. According to a 1996 report, Andrew was barely a hurricane by then, but was formidable nonetheless. Its peak wind gusts were still 70 miles per hour, and the tornadoes spinning off it were even stronger. We huddled in the hallway as he roared and beat against the house. The winds around 100 miles an hour, slower than what was reported to have hit our home in Miami. I only knew the great noise. The numbers would have meant little to me, but 70 miles per hour was plenty strong enough to rip a tree from its roots and throw it against a roof, cleaving a house down the way into two. No building survived the hurricane that hit the Lost Island in 1856. Heart of Louisiana, Lost Island paints a desolate picture of the next day. As the low-lying dunes emerged from the storm surge, not a single structure, not even a foundation, was left on Lost Island. This may explain why so few people have heard of it. There's nothing of the past to see there. The storm submerged the island, and for a while there was no land at all, just the rocking gulf. When the empty land emerged, it was broken and small, a Lazarus land, dead and reborn at the hand of the nameless storm. Lost Island was predominantly a place of leisure, so most of the buildings that disappeared were places of fun. The hotel with its bowling alleys and ballrooms, the stables that rented carriages, the gaming hall. Not all were, though. Behind the vacation homes, there were slave quarters. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1861, 5 years later. The 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, 9 years later. There are stories of slaves who survived the storm, slaves who would see freedom in their lifetimes. But it is easy to imagine that most did not. The records are not entirely clear. Even the general number of dead fluctuates from article to article, though most numbers hover around 200. While some of the dead were brought back to Louisiana for burial, Salinger writes that many were buried in shallow graves on the beach. Others were plundered by pirates and abandoned to the elements. Either way, their bodies are as forgotten as Lost Island. Today, seagulls swarm the beaches, crowding the dark, wet sand, which is spotted with ocean debris, flotsam and jetsam from the tides. The islands are not barren nor empty. They can't be described as pristine, but photos and videos show a place which is little more than a series of sandbars, markedly devoid of the marks of civilization, a perfect memorial for the strength of a raging, unhindered storm. After Andrew, it was weeks before we could leave Baton Rouge and return home. While we waited for the logistics to fall into place, we watched the news. Searching for our neighborhood in the flashing photos, watching the reports became a morbid game. My parents had finally gotten hold of a friend who had word on the state of the house, but there was no cell phone cameras or social media websites back then. There was no easy way to get an actual look at what we still had and what we'd lost. In every shot, Dade County looked post-apocalyptic. Structures stood, but they were wounded things, mutilated homes, missing windows, walls, and roofs, bandaged with leaning plywood sheets and flapping tarps. Mostly, we saw the same houses over and over, footage recycled for impact. There was a house with the message, "Looters beware, woman with PMS and a gun," spray painted across its makeshift repairs, and we laughed every time it flashed on the screen. It wasn't funny, though. The looters were real. The violence was real. The destruction was real. When we finally made it home, it was with a 15-foot trailer in tow for 5 of us. For the next few months, we would sleep there. Our house was totaled, though it stood with all 4 walls and most of the roof intact. Every window was blown out. a blast of debris shooting from it as if an explosion had pushed the glass and our belongings outward in a streak across the lawn. Clothes, toys, photos, trinkets, my Barbies, my books, my CDs. Leaning against our roof was a yellow sailboat that we dry docked on a trailer by the house. At 24 feet long and over 3,000 pounds, it looked like a sunny giant propped up after a hard night at the bar. There was a sunflower in the yard and a roofing tile buried in the front door. Seawater in the washing machine, mold on the walls. Everything we owned was smashed, rotten, toxic. We cleaned out our belongings with shovels. We ate at the Red Cross shelter. We slept in the trailer. We used vouchers to buy clothes. Everything smelled bad. This is how I remember it, in short sentences that describe the passing of time. Particular days are lost. The National Guard trotting past, shirtless, sometimes singing cadences as they went. I'd moon over them from the bus stop as I waited for my best friend to secretly pick me up. A red beret giving my brother his flashlight, my sister his Oreos. A girl screaming in class about the constant buzz of the generators. Stories of dead neighbors. Slipping a quarter in a payphone to get permission to not come home to that 15-foot trailer. The looter who stole our family photos. Crickets chirping as I did homework on the lawn. The semester after Katrina, a sour-faced girl sat in the second row of my class in Hammond. She refused to participate. She gritted her teeth, scowled, muttered. I'm not supposed to admit it, but I hated her. It was hard to concentrate with her constant stream of anger. During group work, she made things hard for the other students, crossing her arms and turning away, giving short answers filled with venom and hatred. It quickly became too much to ignore. I touched her shoulder. I need to talk to you after class, I said. She snarled. I let the other students go and sat on the front desk. I need you to tell me what's going on with you. She broke down. She'd lost a family member in Katrina. Another died soon after. A cousin missing since the storm, no home. She hated everything. She hated everyone. You're the first, she said. I didn't understand. And then I did. No one else had even asked. I was her first to reach out with question, and she was my first to answer. The first student I would walk over to counseling that semester. But hers would not be the last hand I held while we waited for a crisis counselor to be free. I like to say the weather in Lafayette, where I live today, is milder than Baton Rouge or New Orleans. It is a sort of mantra that I have picked up. What it means is this: I do not live in a Category 5 town. I'm too far inland for a storm surge. I'm safe. I'll be okay. None of that is true, though. According to Jeffrey Masters, the director of meteorology at Weather Underground, the traditional rule of thumb is each 2.7 miles of marsh knocks down the storm surge by 1 foot. Unfortunately, that moss is disappearing. According to Matter's map, Lafayette is getting closer to being ashore every year. The barrier islands, the wetlands, the marshes, the miles of physical protection between this city and the Gulf, they're disappearing. The fragile Lacey curve at the border of the nation is failing catastrophically. If land is an investment, a measure of success, what is this loss? I wonder who we are that we let it happen. So that's that story, or that essay. And instead of stopping on loss, I thought, well, I guess this is a little bit about loss. I thought I would read a piece of flash fiction as well. And this is called Pulpo. And it's from my book. I'll just go ahead and read it. Her papa's hands tremble as he opens the olives, something she can do, but asks for help with anyway. It's the same sort of lid the octopus she studies in her lab opens to dig for shrimp while she clicks the buttons on her stopwatch. It's a race. Papa would shake into second, or in a race, Papa would shake into second, the octopus leaving him far behind, slow to leave the table where he chops this morning's catch, slow to take the jar, slow and fumbling as he turns the lid, but fast enough to have caught them dinner. The Pulpo from the first catch of the day, another octopus, but in his nets, in his house, on his tongue that still struggles with English, it is always Pulpo. Tomorrow she will feed her octopus scraps from his fishing nets, and its time will be shorter. It is a fast learner. Her hand in a loosed fist, she presses her thumb against an imaginary button, counts, pushes again. Slower. Her father is getting slower, as if every second gained in the lab is lost here at home. She stays at work too long, wants to be back now. The octopus is amazing, learning as fast as Papa forgets. Its spots grow familiar, like a face, a friend. She's not lonely there at work. She waits for the sound of the pulpo hitting oil, waits for the smell, feels Papa's hand swim across her shoulder as he maneuvers around her. The smell is the same as it has always been. Olive oil, garlic, the tart of lemon cut again. The salt and brine on his clothes and the curtains, the smell of fish from his nets, her necropsies settled deep in the wood. The house will remember, even if they both forget. She steals an olive from his cutting board, like a second from the stopwatch, and then a slice of pulpo, sizzling from the pan. He pops her knuckles, wags his father finger with a smile. Wait, still fast enough for that, too. All right, that's what I have for you guys today. I wanted to keep it on the shorter side because I know it can be hard to listen to things for too long.
Yay! I'm sorry. Maybe that's not, but yeah, that was amazing. Hooray. Thank you so very much, Leigh. Wow. So we are going to do a quick Q&A, and if you would like to ask a question of our fabulous author, I would like you to use the chat to do so. So if you know your microphone works and you would like to speak live, just type your name into the chat and I will call on you, and then you can turn your mic on and we'll do it that way. Or if you would prefer, you can just type your question directly into chat and I will read it out for you. Thank you once again, Leigh. That was fabulous. Yeah. As I mentioned to class earlier, but this was my first hurricane, and I imagine I'm not alone in this room. That we have some other folks for whom in Natchitoches, particularly, this was Natchitoches' first hurricane ever, and your story meant a lot to me. It really, really did.
Thank you, Andy.
Oh, Steph. Awesome. So we have a question from Carly. Carly, please turn your mic on and talk to us. And thank you so much for being here.
Hi. Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm so happy to be here. I'm a little discouraged that it's not in person, but also this was such a great format. Can you talk a little bit about like your writing journey, like just as a writer in general, like growing up and into adulthood?
Absolutely. It's a long story, so I'll give the short version of it. I have a learning disability, which is a disorder of written expression, and it meant that the idea of being a writer was ludicrous to me as a child. Add to that, I was lower middle class. I didn't know any writers. That seemed ridiculous to me. But I love to read. I read just voraciously, and I did write. I wrote these little poems, and I wrote a pop-up book, and I only showed them to my mother because people would laugh at the way I wrote because of my disability that was undiagnosed. But I never stopped. I kept producing these things. I was a terrible liar as a child. That's, I think, true of a lot of writers. So, that was that. I didn't think much of it. It was something that I loved, but I didn't think was real. Um, and then I met Jack Bedell, who I think some of you know. He was the Louisiana Poet Laureate up until I think he was last year and the year before, I think. And Jack and Tim Gautreaux, who also many of you probably know. And they introduced me to, they were writers, and they were people I understood. These were not some New York elite imaginary person. These were people I could communicate with and I understood, and they were kind and they were rough, and they made me learn to be better. And I was a poet. So when I finally went to get my MFA, I went in poetry. And after my first semester, we were allowed to study out of genre for a semester. And so I asked if I could study in fiction, and they said yes. And then I never looked back. So even though I publish in nonfiction, what I just read, poetry still sometimes, and fiction, most of what I do is fiction. So I don't know, is that enough of the journey?
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Outstanding answer. And someone in chat who is appropriately disguising their identity, I love it, added more of a comment than a question, but it's so worth saying, is that I also am really glad about how you explained about hurricanes are moving upland, and the way that particularly this individual said they moved to North Louisiana because of Katrina. But I think we all agree that we were all shocked by what that hurricane did this far north. And yeah, I just want to add in, while maybe some more questions are coming in, what I really love about that essay is the way that you blend science and history and personal narrative all into this fabulous smoothie. Do you have a method behind that, or is that just like what do you know?
Well, I avoided nonfiction for a really long time. I was an academic writer, sure, but creative nonfiction was weird and scary to me. I didn't really want to talk about myself too much outside of, poem here or there. But anything I'm afraid of, I try to try. And so I took a class, and my teacher actually pushed me to write this essay. I never wrote about hurricanes. It was too traumatic for me. And I needed an in to talk about something so painful. And that in was the thing I love, which is research and science. And so, getting into the research and getting into the science and learning was my door. And so that's one reason why it's a blended essay, is because the more I understood, the more I could process my own trauma, I think, and deal with it. Additionally, I think that giving myself a broader view and looking at other hurricanes and thinking about how different my experience in Katrina and my experience in Andrew was, but how exactly the same it was for someone else. Like this girl that I met, her experience in Katrina and my experiences at that same age in Andrew, in some ways mirrored each other. And her anger mirrored my anger. I was so angry all of the time after Andrew. I think helped me talk about something in writing that I did not want to talk about in writing. And so I think just being able to weave this and create a braided narrative and to include things I love to talk about something I hate was the only way I could do it. So I don't know that I have advice for doing it. I just know it was the only way I could tackle it.
That's an amazing answer. I'm just gonna have to say thank you. Laura Finn adds on, it's related. So in general about process, do you start with facts and build them around your story, or do you take a story and then get the facts?
Oh man, I'm a research junkie. So like when I'm teaching my students and they take creative writing and they're like, finally no research. And I'm like, I research for poetry. I research for fiction, I research for everything. Maybe as procrastination. We won't make me seem too big. But I think I research as I go, as I often. But a lot of my stories start because I've learned something that I want to explore. So there's a story in here called Moon Trees, and it is about a teenage girl whose mother is schizophrenic and who has taken this fact about Stuart Rosa, who was very much a real man, who was a fire jumper and then an astronaut, and he took all of these seeds to the moon, and the trees were planted, and they were called the Moon Trees. The character in the story took this story and turned it into her own personal reality. And that came about because I listened to this news story about Stuart Rosa, and I was like, that is the most epically mythological kind of fact I've ever heard. And what happens when that's filtered through different kinds of minds, right? I was obsessed after hearing that news story. I didn't write the story right away. I was obsessed. I learned everything I could find about Stuart Rosa. So I think that the fact that I'm sort of an obsessive learner is sort of folded into all of this. But sometimes I'll hit a fact. So again, in that story, the mother at one point is putting colored saran wrap all on the walls and on the floor and everything, sort of obsessively. And even though the story doesn't say when it takes place, in my head, I knew it took place in the early 90s. And I became obsessed with the idea of, well, was there even colored saran wrap then? So in the middle of Starbucks, I called the saran wrap hotline. And I was like, hey, this is weird, but I'm a writer. And I was just wondering when you guys came out with this product. And she was so lovely. She was like, I've never had anyone ask anything like this. This is so exciting. This is so fun. And she went and found out. So it's kind of a mix of all of those things. Maybe a long answer to a simple question.
No, not at all. That was amazing. Anybody else? Haley asks, how long did it take you to write that hurricane essay? That is an outstanding question.
Yeah. So it's been a few years. The upside is it was for a class. So the first draft had to, come out fairly quickly. I would say the first draft took maybe a month or so. And then editing, I had to put it away and not think about it for a while. So editing on and off probably took about a year and a half, something like that, to get it where it needed or where I wanted it to be. My writing can there's a story in my book that took 20 years to write. So there's a big range and possibilities there. This one, in a lot of ways, went quickly for me. The access was easy because I was in Lafayette, so it was really easy to do a lot of research on hurricane there, which was nice.
Awesome. Anybody else? Well, let me give it another second. Maybe we have a slow typist. On that note, I want to, first off, once again, thank everyone for coming. It really means so much to me that you all came here. And would like to add that if anyone would like me to inform their instructor that they were here, please just type your name and your instructor's name into the chat, and I will see to it that they're informed of your patronage of the arts, for which I am deeply thankful. And lastly, and of course, I want to just say once again, thank you all. Thank you very, very much, Leigh, for being here, for us, for doing all of this for us. It meant the world to me. It was amazing. Thank you all so very much. Please type your thanks in the chat. Feel free to wave however you want to say thank you to Leigh on your way out. Please buy her book from wherever you buy books, Moon Trees and Other Orphans. It is amazing. If you're interested in creative writing, you can always take more creative writing classes with the NSU Creative Writing Department. And if you have any other questions about the Cane River Reading Series, anything else, I'd love to answer them. Otherwise, I will see you guys hopefully again in 3 short weeks on the 22nd of October. And thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, Carly. Goodbye. It was nice seeing you all. Thank you for coming.
Gotcha, Haley. Leigh. Oh, wait, let me stop the recording.